In 1955, in the city of San Francisco, a baby boy was born to a young, unmarried couple. They named him Stephen Paul Jobs. He was adopted shortly after birth by a kind working-class couple, Paul and Clara Jobs. No one could have imagined that this baby, abandoned at birth, would one day build one of the most powerful and beloved companies in the world, Apple. But before that glory, Steve Jobs would face betrayal, humiliation, and one of the greatest comebacks in business history. From a young age, Steve was curious, rebellious, and creative. His father, Paul, was a mechanic who taught him how to use tools, repair cars, and respect craftsmanship. "Whatever you do," his father told him, "make sure it's done right." That idea of carefully crafting things with purpose and precision would later shape Steve's entire philosophy. Jobs grew up in Silicon Valley, long before it became the tech capital of the world. As a teenager, he spent time with electronics, building gadgets in his garage, and exploring new ideas with his friend Steve Wozniak, a shy but brilliant engineer. The two Steves shared a dream: to build something revolutionary. In 1976, at just 21 years old, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started a company in Jobs' parents' garage. They called it Apple Computer. With very little money but enormous vision, they built the first Apple I computer, a simple machine that changed everything. Within a few years, Apple became one of the fastest-growing companies in America. By 25, Steve Jobs was a millionaire. He was featured on magazine covers, hailed as a genius, and celebrated as the face of innovation. But success came with a price. Steve was demanding, perfectionist, and often hard to work with. He pushed his team to their limits, sometimes even beyond. To him, good wasn't enough. Everything had to be insanely great. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh, the first personal computer with a graphical user interface. It was revolutionary, elegant, user-friendly, and far ahead of its time. The commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, promised to change the world, and it did. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. The Macintosh was innovative but expensive. Sales began to slow, and tensions rose between Jobs and the Apple board. His leadership style, passionate but volatile, clashed with corporate expectations. The board, frustrated by internal chaos, decided to side with the newly hired CEO, John Sculley, whom Jobs himself had brought in from Pepsi. Then came the unthinkable. In 1985, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, the very company he had created. He was devastated. Everything he had built, every dream he had chased, was suddenly gone. He was only 30 years old, unemployed, and publicly humiliated. Most people would have given up, but not Steve. Looking back years later, he said, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." Why? Because it forced him to start over, to rediscover creativity, passion, and purpose without pressure. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. The goal was to build advanced computers for universities and businesses. But Next wasn't an instant success. The machines were powerful but too expensive. Critics called it a failure. Yet behind those struggles, Steve was learning, refining his ideas about design, software, and innovation. At the same time, he bought a small animation studio from filmmaker George Lucas. It was called the Graphics Group, later renamed Pixar. Jobs believed in its potential even when no one else did. He invested millions of dollars of his own money, keeping the studio alive through hard times. Years passed. Pixar worked tirelessly on a fully computer-animated film, something never done before. In 1995, Toy Story was released. It became a massive success, earning hundreds of millions of dollars and changing the animation industry forever. Overnight, Pixar became a global phenomenon, and Steve Jobs became a billionaire again. But the story didn't end there. Around the same time, Apple, the company he once founded, was in trouble. Sales were falling, innovation had slowed, and competitors were catching up. In 1996, Apple decided to buy Next, bringing Steve Jobs back into the company he had created and lost over a decade earlier. It was poetic, the prodigal founder returning home. But this time, Steve was wiser, more focused, and more determined than ever. He had learned the hard way how to balance creativity with discipline. In 1997, Jobs took control as Apple's interim CEO. He simplified the company's product line, cut unnecessary projects, and reignited the spirit of innovation. A year later, he introduced something that changed everything again: the iMac. It was colorful, modern, and beautiful. Technology with personality. The world loved it. But Jobs wasn't done. Over the next decade, he led Apple through one of the most remarkable transformations in business history. In 2001, the iPod redefined how people listen to music. In 2007, the iPhone revolutionized communication, putting a computer, camera, and phone into a single sleek device. And in 2010, the iPad changed how we worked, played, and learned. Each product was more than a gadget. It was an experience. Jobs once said, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." His obsession with detail, simplicity, and beauty made Apple's products iconic. Under his leadership, Apple didn't just create devices, it created a culture that believed in innovation, courage, and excellence. And the world responded. Apple became the most valuable company on the planet. But behind the scenes, Steve was fighting a personal battle. In 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He refused to let it slow him down. Even as his health declined, he continued to work, to dream, and to lead. His final years were filled with extraordinary achievements, including the launch of the iPhone 4 and the opening of Apple's glass-walled stores around the world. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away peacefully at his home, surrounded by his family. He was only 56 years old. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his influence. Today, every iPhone, every Mac, every piece of technology that connects people around the world carries his vision, a vision born from curiosity, courage, and creativity. He once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Steve Jobs' journey wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, the ability to fall, rise again, and create something even greater. He went from being a college dropout to a tech visionary, from being fired by his own company to saving it from collapse. He proved that success is not a straight line. It's a journey of constant learning, risk-taking, and believing in yourself when no one else does. His story reminds us that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a part of it. If Jobs hadn't been fired, there would be no Pixar, no Next, and perhaps no modern Apple. Sometimes life's hardest moments are the turning points that lead us toward greatness. When he returned to Apple in 1997, Jobs stood before his employees and said, "We're here to make a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why even be here?" That line defined his philosophy, that our purpose isn't just to exist, but to create, to inspire, and to leave something meaningful behind. Steve Jobs changed the world, not by following trends, but by creating them. His vision lives on in every innovation that makes our lives easier, smarter, and more connected. From a boy tinkering in his father's garage to a man who revolutionized technology, Steve Jobs' story teaches one timeless truth. You can lose everything, be defeated, and still come back stronger. Because success isn't about never falling. It's about rising every time you do.